Great. So thank you everybody for coming. I'm very excited to organize and host this panel event, which was coordinated together with my colleague Diane Walker and Adele Aubrey from the Humanitarian Conflict Response Institute Initiative, I never get that right, in the University of Manchester. My name is Amy Shapner-Onan. I'm a senior lecturer in humanitarian studies in the Liverpool School of Tropical Medicine, and I am the co-director together with Diane Walker, of the LEAP education program, which is a program for practicing humanitarians in the field to improve their leadership for education. And we have some students from this program and people who are involved, and we also have academics working on humanitarian education. So I will present everyone soon. We're going to have 5 presentations followed by a discussion on the topic of practical leadership through education. So we're going to look at what does humanitarian education mean, give some examples of humanitarian education, an overview, and highlight some of the challenges. Some of the challenges we're particularly interested in are how humanitarian education empowers practitioners, but also how it confronts us with the reality of north-south divide and inequalities, and how we can try through education to broaden the scope of humanitarians, but also this means, increasing critical reviews of humanitarians. So it's a broad discussion of what is education, how can we use education, and whether education is, and I think this is where we maybe be discussing, is education the solution to humanitarian problems, or is it also demonstrating some of the conflicts? Before I introduce the different panelists, I will give some general house rules. We will have the questions at the end. You can pose questions in the chat during the session, but we'll only ask them after. We'll only answer them afterwards. And you can also raise your hands at the end, but we will only answer them afterwards. Okay. So thank you, everyone. I also want to specifically thank the IHSA for organizing it and facilitating this and demonstrating their interest. So thank you, guys, and thank you for the people in the room for helping. Our first panel will be given by Adriana Stibral, Nazanin Zeda Cummings, and Matthew Clark. Adriana is a PhD candidate and a casual academic staff at the Deakin University in Melbourne. She's also a humanitarian trainer for Red R Australia. Previously, Adriana was employed as a humanitarian studies lecturer and a course director at Charles Darwin University in Australia. Her professional experience and research focus include development in humanitarian action, humanitarian studies, professionalization, and curriculum design. Nazanin Zadeh Cummings joined Deakin University Center for Humanitarian Leadership in 2018, just before earning her PhD from City University of Hong Kong. She did her master's in humanitarian studies in NOAA and now teaches on one. So have become increasingly interested in issues of humanitarian education. Her other education research is mainly about North Korea. And I invite you to attend her session on Friday morning about this. Matthew Clark. Matthew is the Pro-Vice Chancellor for Research Development at Deakin University. He has been working in the humanitarian and development sector for over 2 decades, starting his career with World Vision Australia. His primary location of research is the Pacific. Abel, which will be our first student representative. Abel Otiano Kaisa is a health and humanitarian data specialist with extensive experience in health research and informatics. He serves as data manager at MSF Belgium Kenya Mission in Imbu, where his roles include operational research, focal point unit lead. Previously, he worked as a research data consultant in the Kenyatta National Hospital and as a data analyst for several human and animal health science research at Kenya International Hospital and Veterinaire and Agronom Sans Frontières. Sheikh Abeida Islam is a humanitarian field worker from Bangladesh. She started her career as the head of mission support, a national staff position in MSF Bangladesh mission, and since has been working in the field for the past 3.5 years. Abida has been working in Bangladesh and Papua New Guinea in different positions in both field and capital. She's just become an international staff. She is currently admin manager for MSF OCP, so the Paris branch project in Maiduguri, Nigeria, as a first mission, and a student on the LEAP program since 2019. Aya El-Kaznadar is a medical doctor and works as a medical liaison officer for MSF reconstructive surgery program in Amman, Jordan. She joined MSF and Humanitarian Action 2.5 years ago, and she's based in Gaza, Palestine. She's currently a student on the LEAP program. And finally, Phillis Weissman from MSF Crash. Fabrice graduated from the Institut des Études Politiques de Paris and joined MSF in 1995. He spent several years as logistician and head of mission in sub-Saharan Africa, including Sudan, Eritrea, Ethiopia, Liberia, Sierra Leone, Guinea, and other countries, as well as in Kosovo, Sri Lanka, and more recently in Syria. He has published several articles and books on humanitarian action, including In the Shadow of Just Wars, Violence, Politics, and Humanitarian Action, Humanitarian Negotiation Revealed, the MSF Experience, and Saving Lives and Staying Alive, Humanitarian Security in the Age of Risk Management. I hope I've done you all justice. And I suggest that we start, please, with the presentation from our team in Diakin. So I will mute myself.
Excellent. Thank you. I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen. Unless I hear otherwise, I'll assume everyone can see it. So first, it's wonderful to be here with you all virtually, here with my lovely co-author team and those of you around the world who are gathered in this hybrid space to talk about this really important question of education in the humanitarian sector. I'm really looking forward to the discussion today. As this slide shows, this paper is titled Mastering Humanitarianism, a survey of postgraduate humanitarian action courses. And this has been a joint effort between myself and my colleagues, Adriana and Matthew. And we're based at Deakin University, which I'd also like to acknowledge is based on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and acknowledge that we live on stolen land. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the paper, and then I'll hand over to Adriana to talk about some bits, and then we'll close with kind of some implications and provocations for further discussion. So before I speak about our specific research question, I want to situate the paper a little bit, which is within this broader sphere of humanitarian education and training. So we have lots of examples on the screen. They're not exhaustive. But we were kind of asking questions about the role of education and training and seeing all these different initiatives, but our own roles within the kind of university system made us particularly interested in understanding degree programs further, and in particular, Masters of Humanitarian Assistance programs, which I'll call MHA degrees. As Imre said in the introduction, I myself am a graduate of an MHA program, the NOHA program, and now teach on one. So I'm really interested in this question of what do these master's programs offer to the humanitarian endeavor. So Adriana, Matthew, and myself were all kind of asking these questions and came together to write this paper. And our core research question is, how do current Masters of Humanitarian Assistance, or MHA, offerings converge and differ? And how can such courses further their contribution to the humanitarian endeavor? I'll maybe add a few notes on the paper. The first is that it's currently under review. and we are hoping that we will have it published shortly. I think we're almost there. And then the second is that we really see this as a pilot study, and we see so much that can come out of this. And I'm really looking forward to the Q&A and to the discussion to see what further questions and opportunities can arise even from this intimate, but I think really valuable group of people that we have together here today. So I want to be clear that while this is the question of the paper that we are presenting today, we recognize that our answers actually lead to more questions than they answer, perhaps. So the first thing this paper established to do was actually figure out, well, how many of these courses are there out there? We talk about these Masters of Humanitarian Assistance. What's out there? And we ended up finding 26 Anglophone MHA courses that were offered in the United States, Europe, the UK, Australia, India, and Nigeria. I'll talk a little bit more about the geographic distribution of these courses later on in the presentation. But so we found these 26 courses and then did some work to try to identify what are the common components of these courses, but also what are the elements that make them quite distinct. And one of the very early findings that I think is quite striking is that when we compared our findings and our selection criteria to an earlier study done in 2010 by Reinhorn et al., we found that there had been nearly a fourfold increase in these courses in only 10 years. So it shows a real increase in this offering of postgraduate master's level generalist humanitarian courses. So because we were trying to wrap our heads around what this specific Masters of Humanitarian Assistance is offering and what's out there, we had quite a strict inclusion criteria. And I'm very keen to perhaps speak more about this in the discussion. So we were only looking at master's level courses, and we were looking at specifically at Anglophone courses. So courses could include components in other languages, but primarily had to be delivered in English. We found very quickly that there's no common approach to naming these courses. So we were really looking for generalist courses. So we ended with programs that have either humanitarianism and then humanitarian assistance, aid, action, studies, affairs, practice, some kind of general word in the course title. So non-generalist programs, things like humanitarian law, humanitarian engineering, those were excluded because we were really more interested in understanding the general humanitarian education and what it could contribute to the field. And of course, with a curriculum focus on humanitarian assistance. We did look at programs that have two components. So for example, a program could be called Refugee Studies and Humanitarian Assistance, and that would be included, but something just in Refugee Studies would not be included. And this was really because, as I said, this is a kind of scoping and pilot study to understand the current status of these courses, but also uncover our thoughts on how they could contribute further to the sector. So we collected this data in late 2019 and early 2020 and used past literature, but also searches through various websites to do keyword searches to try to find publicly available information. And I'll also underline that this data, this paper is all based on a data set of publicly available information. So it doesn't include things like student feedback or things like that. It also focuses on the actual courses themselves. I think we have many ideas for future studies, and one being one that actually looks at, well, who are the students taking these courses? It's one thing for a course to exist and another to know, well, who actually is enrolling in it. So this was the approach we took that really relied on public information. So with that overview, I'll hand over now to my colleague Adriana to discuss a little bit about the results and findings.
Thanks, Nazanin. I hope everyone can hear me loud and clear. So the initial search results showed that there were 387 humanitarian studies or action-related master's degree programs offered around the world. Now, that's a whole lot, but we quickly discovered that with this initial search, that of those 387 programs, the majority actually didn't fit our course inclusion criteria. So in other words, a lot of programs that showed up were titled Peace and Conflict Studies or International Humanitarian Law, Public Health Studies or Risk Studies. So that means when we looked at those other programs, it's a paid research. They might have had some humanitarian elements, but they would not present a main focus, if that makes sense. So as we can see here on this chart, which is interesting in itself, that despite there being over 300 programs initially, and later on we narrowed it down to 26, the majority of those programs appear to be in Europe, as you can see, but also in North America, followed by Oceania. And there's actually quite only a small amount of programs being offered out in Asia, the Asia Pacific region, Africa, and South America. So like I said, in the end, we only had 26 courses offered that fit those criteria Nazanin mentioned before. Next slide, please. Those three following slides will just show you a brief overview of those courses that we have included in our analysis. So you can see on the left-hand side the university offering the courses, and you can see in the middle there what the program is titled, and you can also see the location where the program is being offered. Interesting, if we can just go one slide back, please, a couple of slides back. Yes, on the bottom there you can see that the Erasmus Mundus Joint Master's Program in International Humanitarian Action, also referred to the Network on Humanitarian Action, NOAA, is a kind of a consortium of various universities, 9 of which are based in the EU, but there's other partner universities, and they have come together to kind of offer a jointly recognized master's program that has a quite similar course structure and course content. Next slide, please. And the next one. Yeah, so at the bottom there you can see the couple ones in Nigeria as well as the one in India. Yep, next slide. Now, this is probably the more interesting bit as well. So those 26 courses that we then had as our findings, we kind of delved deeper and analyzed and looked at different themes or commonalities across all those course offerings. So we looked at what are the course entry requirements. We also were able to see commonalities across flexibility, research, practical components, and so-called thematic curriculum foci in regard to teaching. Now, I won't go through all of those, but what it basically means is that across those 4 areas, there were a lot of similarities across those courses. Some of them might have changed. For instance, in the field of flexibility, what that is meant, are they offered online or on campus? Can people do them part-time, full-time? Since COVID-19 has broken out, probably a lot of universities adopted or adapted their courses, I should rather say, and maybe have now a bigger online presence. What we really want to highlight here are the practical components and the so-called thematic curriculum foci with regard to teaching. Nearly half of all programs that we analyzed offer practical components either as an optional or compulsory element. And practical components can mean anything from fieldwork to humanitarian training to doing internship and placements with aid organizations, or having international placements. That means having some sort of overseas mobility. And thematic curriculum foci are very vast, but we will look at the next slide to kind of understand better what exactly is meant by that and what the different themes are. Okay, so on this chart, we can see on the bottom there, that's the different themes or topics that we kind of identified that are being embedded into the curricula. And you can also see in terms of the numbers or the quantity, how many of the universities have this element or topic or theme integrated into their curriculum. And so on the very left-hand side, you can, by the way, sorry, the blue bar means it's compulsory, the orange one means it's optional. So on the very left-hand side, you can start by seeing that research or doing a dissertation is basically a compulsory element across all the different programs. Same as for very basic basic element of history of humanitarianism and the humanitarian system. So understanding the history, understanding the frameworks, everything from ethics to cutting issues in aid theory and practice. And then you can see, like mentioned before, practical components are shared by half. And this goes further down to management, global governance, politics of aid and international relations, as well as topics like public health or global health seems to be also delivered by at least 10 universities there, followed by development studies and protection and international humanitarian law. Further towards the right, you can see that disaster and emergency management topics or conflict resolution and peace building are also being offered, but not across the board by all universities. As we also can see that when a theme isn't covered as a compulsory, so it's not as a embedded as a key unit or subject, it's still depending on where the program is housed, in which department of the university, it might be an optional element of the course. That's all from me. Thank you.
Thank you, Adriana. I think Adriana just really showed how we found there was so much diversity in the understanding of or in the interpretation of what it means to study a generalist humanitarian degree, that there's so many different areas that went into these courses. However, what was not so diverse was the overwhelming presence of global North universities in the data set, and particularly, as you can see on the map, the UK having 8 of the 26 programs, so being far and away the main place where these programs are being taught. So there are 2 universities in Nigeria and 1 in India that offered courses that fell within the inclusion criteria, but otherwise all of the universities were located in North America, Europe, the UK, or Australia. So as I mentioned earlier, we did have an Anglophone inclusion criteria, so that may have been one limiting factor. So for example, I've heard of courses in French that may have been eligible for the study if we had widened the criteria. But it's also important to recognize that universities all over the world teach in English. So the Anglophone criteria is important, but it's not the only limiting factor. Our data collection method, as I mentioned, was publicly based on publicly available information, and this may also have influenced the findings, because we found some suggestion of courses outside of the Global North. For example, a suggestion of a course at the University of Juba in Humanitarian and Conflict Studies, but couldn't find any reliable or accessible information about it online. But I really think that those potential explanations don't really cut it. I think this is really showing that the global power dynamics that are impacting tertiary education more broadly, where global North universities have more access to resources, to travel, to reputational clout than their counterparts in the global South, that this is manifesting in a phenomenon where there are mainly global North universities educating students for careers that will often have them living and working in the global South. So I think this harkens back to some of Imre's earlier comments at the beginning of the session around, well, what does this offer and how does it potentially perpetuate issues of power, but also how can humanitarian education address issues of power? So I think really what we're seeing here is that in many ways, the Global North focus and the entity of the university being, I think particularly the modern university, in many ways a very colonial entity, in some ways reinforcing power inequalities. But then we're also seeing that, you know, master's programs offer this space to do this research and this critical thinking. So I think we have a lot of further research and understanding to do and discussion to have around how to address this phenomena of the Global North University really having overwhelming presence in this question of who is educating in the Masters of Humanitarian Assistance field. But there's also the question of how humanitarian studies programs relate to other areas. And so this is some implications, linkages, and future work. And so I won't touch on all of these, but I'll speak now to kind of the second point, which is, well, what's the difference between an MHA, particularly in comparison to other courses? So for example, disaster preparedness or emergency management courses, master's programs. There's in Adriana's PhD, she's found some kind of early findings that this understanding of humanitarianism can be very, very different among different stakeholders, and some may resonate more with terms like disaster management. And so what is the currency of humanitarian studies and of a master's of humanitarian assistance versus some of these other related or allied fields? The last implication that I'll touch on here is that I will note that IHSA has another panel on the 5th of November, I believe that's Friday, titled Teaching Violence, Trauma, Professionalization, and Humanitarian Education, to continue some of these questions on humanitarian education. And finally, we have had lots of discussion around this question of a core curriculum. As we've seen, there's a lot of interpretation of what it means to educate a humanitarian studies master's student in the various courses and themes that we found. And so we question, is this a sign that there should be discussion across universities and across stakeholders to construct a core curriculum to give a bit more currency and meaning to masters of humanitarian assistance? But if we go down this route, how can this core curriculum be constructed in a way that is not a global north dominated exercise, keeping in mind the map I just showed you on the previous slide? So I think with that, we will close our presentations. And as I said, we welcome any feedback, critique, discussion, or comments. Thank you, everyone.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Nazanin and Adriana and Matti. That was really interesting and certainly very relevant. And I can already think of some follow-up questions for that. So very informing to that. I suggest we proceed with Abaida's presentation. Abaida, if I don't think you have a PowerPoint, so you can just present when you want, and I'll mute myself.
So hello, I'm Abida. Good morning to everybody. I would like to talk. I'm a student in LEAP program since 2019, and I would like to talk a bit about the history and archiving from different perspectives in my field. So I joined the LEAP program in 2019 when I was working as a head of mission support. And previously I have studied international relations in my home country, which is University of Dhaka in Bangladesh. And of course, studying international relations also gives you a bit of humanitarian feeling because they talk about humanitarian endeavors, refugee studies, migration, and things like that. So this is also one of the things that made me interested in studying LEAP. And also, I also wanted to study in a university that is in the global south, and I wanted to see the difference that how things change from both perspectives. And these 2 years I have been studying here, and I can tell you that it's taught me a lot. So one of the interesting things about studying in global south and global north is that when you study in a university, at least in my opinion or in my experience, it now doesn't necessarily include the perspective of the global south. We have studied the things that are written by Anglophone authors. Most of the history and the implications that we studied about has a Western-centric focus, the wars and the conflicts that are really important mostly for the South. It didn't have a global, a Southeast focus, and people did not seem to have that awareness that we need to study that, study history from the focus of the global South. But when I studied in LEAP, studying in everyone seems to be very aware of the lack of diversity of voice and very conscious about how we can work to remedy it while we are studying about it. So in that light, I would like to talk, I can talk about many examples how the study has changed the way we practice stuff in the field. And but what I would like to focus on here, that how the studies have gave us an awareness that we need to be working of preserving the history in the field and that unique voice that we have because we are working in the field. So I'm going to be frank here, I'm just a field staff. I don't have really possess many powers to make decisions. But what we, from studying from LEAP program, what we could do is that we could inform our teammates who actually can make some decisions. And I would not say that we made any changes single-handedly, but because of the education, we could integrate that perspective that helped all of us create some awareness in my teammates and my classmates that we need to integrate more voices from the community and the national staff in the decision making who are actually on the field. So something I would like to mention in my experience and in where I work in the MSF fields, it's always a situation of need. It's always a situation about emergency, and that is absolutely necessary to save lives. We always have limited time, a lot of people work to do, and it's really sometimes difficult to integrate those ideas of that okay, we are making some decisions for next year, maybe we should integrate that, what our national staff think, what our community people think, people who are serving, maybe we should integrate those voices. That becomes a difficult practice, and we sometimes do not have that in our minds. But because of our education in LEAP and our humanitarian studied education, we actually had a critical idea that there is a need of integrating those voices, because our action, it not only saves lives right now, it has a historical impact on things. So we need to document and archive why we are doing things, and we need, in our decision making process, we need to integrate those voices of the people of the community. So I can give you one example, is that in Bangladesh in the field, I had the pleasure of working with some of my LEAP classmates who were my teammates. So what once we did is, before making a yearly budget for next year, we created a workshop where we integrated all of our national staff at various positions, and we sit together and brainstormed their ideas that, okay, next year, what does it look like for you? What do you think should be focusing on? What are your voices? What are your ideas? And I think one of the reasons we could do that is that we had this awareness coming from, I can name the courses even where they're from the LEAP and the history of humanitarian actions and the humanitarian management, where we actually got the awareness that integrating those voices were important. Another example I can give is the archiving method. So what was happening is, we were making decisions day to day, but we are not archiving those letters. So like, for example, in 1970s, you could see a letter sent to the headquarters. You could understand why a humanitarian was making a decision. Now it's all mails, phone calls, WhatsApp messages. It's really difficult to trace those ideas 5 years later. Okay, what happened in Ukhia in Bangladesh, in Cox's Bazar, or Maduguri in Nigeria, and why did we make those decisions? What exactly happened? Those become very difficult to understand. So what we did is, we created an archiving system, and in the Bangladesh project, and my head of mission was also a LEAP participant, and we talked about it, and we implemented a system of archiving. So those voices, what we talked about the community, what the sociological report that we got from the community directly, those became archived. So those did not get lost in the way of time and electronics and stuff like that. So I can provide many examples of how the education have changed the approach of how we work, and I have personally learned a lot from it. However, I would like to conclude by saying that I have learned a lot about leadership from this humanitarian practices. It gave me from a tunnel view to a global perspective, that what we do on the field has a very long-term impact on not only humanitarian history, but also on the community that we work on, and also the practices that later the line developed for the humanitarians. So as a leader, we have to think about short-term effects and also the long-term effects of our action, and critically think about how our institutions' actions are affecting the people involved in long and short term. So what I can say is that I hope by the time I finish with this education, and a lot of my colleagues are finished with this, we can really learn a lot about how our leadership should be changed to make our organization's leadership to change for the better in the future. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you very much, Abida. That was really great. Really interesting stuff and a lot to sort of reflect. I suggest we proceed to Abel. Abel, if you can unmute and it'd be great to hear your presentation.
Good morning, everyone. I'm very happy to be here and to share with you my reflection on humanitarian education and experience of it. In this short presentation, I would like to just discuss how my own path in the leadership education academic partnership, that's LEAP, impacted my work. We are looking at the context of a project by Médecins Sans Frontières, so that's MSF, in Embu, Kenya, where I've been working as data manager for the past 4 years now. The project involved building the capacity of the Ministry of Health workers in the management of non-communicable diseases. For much of the history of the project, MSF focused its efforts on empowering the clinicians. So that's doctors, nurses, and clinical officers. But in the process, overlooked some of the departments which are equally critical to the provision of healthcare services. For example, laboratory and pharmacy departments. So the effect of this biased approach was a lopsided intervention where clinicians were empowered on the guidelines and all the processes that needed to be followed. But on the other hand, the other health professionals that I've mentioned were not equally empowered, and there was some exclusion leading to like the impact of the process was not so sustainable. So presently, MSF is shifting to a more community-centered approach here in Embu with the creation of 2 community revolving pharmacies, and that would hopefully ensure a consistent supply of medication subject to affordability. With the present efforts focusing on only the pharmacy or the drugs availability and the accessibility components of those medicines, there seems to be a risk of excluding the clinical work, laboratory services, patient education, and documentation that comes with all the pharmacy-related tasks. So it's basically almost the same problem that we had before. So not much lessons learned. So with the knowledge and exposure gained from the LEAP program, I've been able to realize a broader perspective of humanitarian activities. And I believe this was also highlighted by Abida. I'm also able to accommodate the ideas proposed by my colleagues because of the LEAP program, having the understanding of the bigger picture. I've been able to question the approaches we employ as the project level to solve problems. For instance, I've been able to question the exclusion of some departments in the initial design of the project. Initially, the project laid too much emphasis on mentorship of the clinicians, and to some extent overlooked even the patient outcomes. Like, for example, how many patients are actually having controlled blood pressure, and we were more focused on the learning outcomes. I've also been able to develop tools that have led to greater efficiency in our project work. For instance, I've developed the data management standard operating procedure and also supported the development of more patient-centered indicators. And this is mainly attributed to the humanitarian education that I've had in the recent past. Most of the things that I've learned have been able to kind of just apply them in the process of my work. Finally, I've also been able to conduct a systematic review of literature for 2 operational research studies that currently we are undertaking. So as a result of the LEAP program, I think one of the toughest questions that I've asked, but seems is still a continuing question, is the exclusion of the laboratory services from the community revolving pharmacies. Understandably, there are pharmacies, but then the laboratory components are usually useful for the monitoring of the patients and to just decide on which what medications to change for for the non-communicable disease patients. So by the end of the project, through the more patient-focused approach to activity monitoring, the Ministry of Health has been able also to adopt some of the patient quality outcome indicators that we as MSF used in the final 2 years. Initially, these proposals on the change of indicators and even the proposals to change the approach were not received so positively, mainly because they seem to oppose the established procedures. However, I later modified the approach given the skills that I had gained on advocacy and the continuous humanitarian education, and hopefully there are a few things that have been changed here and there. So together with the rest of the team here, we have been able to support the advocacy for the local purchase of medicines, which have ensured fewer stockouts as it bridged the lead time gap for the supply of medicines. So usually it's sourced from MSF supply. So far, the questioning has not really yielded a change of plans as far as the community revolving pharmacies are concerned. For instance, we know that the creatinine and the HbA1c tests, which are two tests that are important to monitor the non-communicable disease patients, are being excluded. And if these are excluded, then it will be impossible to really learn how the patients are doing. So the clinical work also being excluded is an evidence that there still needs to be more advocacy and more lobbying to just ensure that all these departments are included in the process. So contact tracing is something that we have successfully included in the community revolving pharmacies, and these are critical just to ensure that patients are not lost to follow-up. So I would like to briefly compare and contrast the LEAP program to my previous education, which I did here in Kenya. So some of the similarities are that the delivery of the content is, of course, through lectures, and there's also the requirement of the students to do both core and optional modules. However, I feel the biggest difference is the desire to use practical experience and to allow each student to choose their own pathway within the same course. Overall, being part of the humanitarian education has enhanced my influence on the decisions, although just here, even at project level, which has led to greater participation and involvement on issues. However, the response from my colleagues has not always been consistently positive. While sometimes it is really frustrating to try and engage my colleagues, especially when advocating for the inclusion of all departments where it is unlikely to be a success. Sometimes their support has been overwhelming. For example, when I developed the data management SOP, most people are very willing to adopt them. At other times, of course, it takes time for them to realize the need for those proposals or even the change of mindsets. For instance, when I proposed the change of the indicators. All in all, humanitarian education has equipped me with transversal skills applicable in both stable and unstable contexts. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Abba. That was really interesting. Thank you so much. I think this is also ties in quite nicely with Alia's presentation. So just so we'll have the time for discussion, let's proceed with Alia, which I think touches similar issues. Alia, over to you.
Thank you, Imre. Hello, everyone. I'm Alia. I'm a National Medical Liaison Officer for MSF's Reconstructive Surgery Program in Amman. I am based in Gaza. My background is I'm a medical doctor. My humanitarian experience took off when I joined MSF in 2019. What I'm about to present are my personal reflections. Those reflections arose from the context that I work in within MSF's projects in Gaza and Amman. So far, I've studied one semester. I'm in the second one currently in my postgraduate master's degree through the LEAP program. I admire how this program merges experience and knowledge to provide best education for the students. I've learned a great deal about evidence and how to critically approach it. I learned about disaster preparedness, disaster risk reduction within the humanitarian context, as well as the emergency management cycle. Humanitarian education has been helpful for my role and my work. Education empowered me in terms of leadership, involvement in decision-making, context analysis, and it made me more confident challenging some of the decisions made on the field. I have become more proactive in my role and as a team member, trained within the multidisciplinary team providing patient care, and I've been able to critically approach evidence and formulate arguments backed by evidence. My role currently isn't a role that gives much space for application of knowledge, or even so the context I work in. It doesn't always give room to apply theoretical education and academics as much as it does for experience gained on the field. Not all we learn can be a good fit for practice on the field. And this is especially true with the kind of trauma cases we manage in the project, and the context and the cases are very special. If we apply theoretical knowledge merely, the results will be disasters. And this is especially regarding the cases that have multiple traumas and that have bone infections, or what we call osteomyelitis, who will probably end up with an amputation if we merely stick to the guidelines developed by the Global North. The guidelines were developed for cases that are injuries not related to conflict. Experience has taught us a lot in this field, as MSF has previously worked with such cases in Haiti and Amman. This experience is both technical and also in regards of taking patient values and beliefs in consideration while treating the cases. However, at certain times I feel this can be an excuse not to provide optimum care based on latest evidence for patients. I've been challenging decision makers within the project and the decision followers as well. Sometimes points of view can be different, and people find it a bit easier to accept or follow the advice or point of view of a certain person merely because they're an expat from the Global North rather than someone who is a national or someone who is from the region, even though the validity of the advice or knowledge shared by the national is also sound. Depending on the person being challenged, sometimes reflections are more than welcome, but other times they're not. One of the main constraints I'm facing currently as I go forward with my education include conflict with others when trying to argue current practice on the field and critically analyze context. Sometimes opinion is not as welcomed as one can suppose and can be even opposed. This is especially when questioning decisions made on the field or criticizing a service or even the quality of a service we are providing to the target community. I realize that some believe that if we're providing a quality that is somewhat better than that provided by the Ministry of Health in the country, then we're doing a great job, even though this quality we're providing does not match the minimum standard of care in the developed world or the Global North. For example, sometimes we keep saying we're offering comprehensive patient care, but at times we do not communicate properly, neither to the patient nor to each other. Decisions around patient management can be made by one member only with no involvement of other members or even the patients themselves in the decision-making process. I believe that it seems like some think as long as we're using better quality drugs, better quality equipment, then we're good, which is not true. I think also this has to do with the vertical decision-making approach we seem to be stuck in right now. We say we want to provide patient-centered care, but when making decisions, we just involve the top-level positions and forget to involve those who are on the front line, the doctors, the nurses, the physiotherapists who are spending most of the time interacting with the patients. In addition, I've become personally uncertain if we're actually doing the best we can to provide the best service with the best quality possible to patients. In other words, are we providing the needed service to the needed population? It is difficult, as I said, to apply theoretical knowledge and latest evidence-based medicine in the field when you're working in the humanitarian field or context in a third world country bound by conflict like mine. But why aren't projects, services, protocols evolving at a similar pace as the needs are evolving? This is a question I found hard to answer. Regarding the project in the context I work in, it seems to me personally that sometimes policies and protocols are shaped based on a referent or a coordinator experience that is merely with no effort to apply evidence. Experience that is gained at a mission elsewhere at a different context may not yield the same results when applied in another context. I believe that we're not doing enough to critically analyze our services and practices on the field, and we're not doing enough to modify them to provide better outcomes. When facing issues in the project I work in, I believe we need to do more to research the issues and not just to report the issue. Like, for instance, recently we faced some aggression from patients. We kept reporting that we're facing this, but did we do research? Like, did we dig deep into the root of this problem to see what we can do to fix it? I believe we did not do enough in that regard. I believe my education progress is helping me undermine and challenge the existing power dynamics on the field, not just through a semester I've studied, but maybe through my experience in the past 2 years as someone who values research and analysis. I believe that now I can be more outspoken and that I can argue with power figures within the project. And as a national staff, arguing policies put by an international expat, I believe that humanitarian education did indeed empower me. Participating in a program like LEAP has made me realize that humanitarian practice isn't a one-size-fits-all, and it is not something merely taught in academia, but it also involves experience on the field. It made me realize how unreasonable power dynamics can be sometimes on the field, like giving enormous decision-making and policy-shaping power to positions that can have minimal impact or involvement on the field, and how they are shifted mainly towards the global north. Education systems need to address inequality and the bias dynamics one can face on the field, and they need to be inclusive and diverse in the topics they cover. Education should also be readily available to everyone who will be working in the humanitarian field. So those are my reflections. I hope I covered them enough. Thank you.
Great, Alia. That was really interesting and very relevant. And I think really sort of touched a lot of the other topic, and I have a lot of thoughts. So Fabrice, I will invite you to speak now. I think it's also a good follow-up because, you know, a lot of what you're interested in is the context of decision-making maybe. So over to you.
Yeah, thank you. So, well, thanks for all this presentation. I wanted to make a point echoing the various presentations done so far on basically what does it mean to be a professional humanitarian worker, and more specifically a professional humanitarian coordinator, and how can academic training help in this regard. Those are the two questions which led to the creation of the LEAP. And for which I would like to share with you some assumptions, some ideas. To start with, I would like to remember the fact that the function of coordinator, head of mission, project coordinator, has not always existed in MSF. For a very long time, up to the 80s, there was doctors, logisticians, nurses, pharmacists, drivers, translators, but there was no such a position as a coordinator. This was invented by the end of the 80s, mainly due at that time to coordinate security-related issues. And the coordinator progressively became this person who have with this overall responsibility of assessing a situation from a public health security, political, operational point of view, and making decision on who to help in priority, on at what cost in terms of exposure to danger, exposition to danger, in terms of deviation from quality standards when it comes to medical practices or any kind of technical practices which rely on quality standard. With regards to which extent do we accept to be instrumental for the various political powers we are dealing with, and so on. So, and someone as well able to organize the work, to make sure that people can work together towards the same goal. So this function somehow emerge, and it's quite specific because as we all know, there are trainings for becoming doctors, for becoming a pharmacist, for becoming a driver or mechanic, but there is no training for becoming a humanitarian coordinator. In a sense, I mean, there are many, as illustrated by the first presentation, but there is no equivalent, I would say, in the normal life outside of the ed world. I mean, you would find a doctor outside of the ed world, you would find a driver outside of the ed world, but but the very function of being a humanitarian coordinator, there is no equivalent in the, I don't know how to call it, the civilian world, the non-ed world. There is no such a position. And so how do you become a professional ed worker, a professional coordinator, knowing that this was as well one of the leading point of for the creation of the LEAP. What characterizes the role of a humanitarian coordinator is the high level of uncertainty you have to deal with. Would you be activity manager, field coordinator, or head of mission in Gaza, in Maiduguri, in Blantyre, having to deal with so different issues such as, I mean, the COVID epidemics in Malawi and the fear of vampires, that's to say the way people interpret power relationship in Malawi, and see sometimes health professionals are being vampire, which represents sometimes a security risk. In dealing with, I mean, jihadi groups in Maiduguri, with a totalitarian state in North Korea, with very authoritarian regime in Ethiopia and in Tigray. I mean, with unknown viral disease which re-emerge, like COVID, Ebola, or anyway, there is a very high diversity of situation humanitarian coordinator have to deal with. And on a high, so very high diversity of situation, and as well a lot of difficulty to, I mean, uncertainty derived as well from the difficulty we have to gather information. I mean, we all know that when we reach a field, we always have to decide based on partial, on incomplete, unreliable information. This is part of the job. You know, we cannot expect to have a full picture, to have evidence for everything. So this uncertainty derives from the diversity of the situation we are confronted with, from the fog of war, the limited information we have to make decision, from what we could call the friction, the fact that the aid apparatus will never react as we anticipated. I mean, I'll take the example of MSF, but I think this is the case for every institution. I mean, it's not because you make a decision that it will be implemented. So this is why humanitarian coordinator is a profession that does not exist in the civilian world, which is characterized by a very high degree of uncertainty, and for which you cannot just expect people, and this was well illustrated by last presentation by Alia, you cannot just expect people to apply standardized protocols, standardized procedure, to repeat mechanical attitude, mechanical projects. A professional humanitarian worker, coordinator, should be able to invent for each situation a really customized setup. He has to decide. So it's a very specific job. So how do you get trained to develop the competencies needed to reach these competencies, these skills, which will help you to decide under uncertainty, to decide who to help in priority, at what price, how, and to organize the resources to achieve your goals, which is basically what we expect from an activity manager to a sales responsible or to director of operations with all the layers in between. For sure, this competency, you acquire it by doing in the field. I mean, mainly it's 95% by doing that you become a coordinator. It's like, well, it's true for every dimension of our work. It's more specifically true with security management. When you try to teach security management in a classroom, how do you teach in a classroom how to manage drunk soldiers at a checkpoint, or to make sense of the various rumors circulating in town with regard to the imminence of an offensive, how to build a network of informants, or to decide to identify people who will protect you in case of danger. This you don't, I mean, you can see that it's a very practical know-how which you learn by doing, by sharing the experience of more seasoned professional, by your colleagues from the national staff, and so on. So it would be one answer to the question. We say you don't learn to be a humanitarian coordinator. I mean, you learn by doing, but academic work cannot help. This somehow has been more or less the case in MSF for the past 40 years. But personally, and I think LEAP is a good demonstration of it, I think that academic training can help. Of course, it will not be enough as such, but it can really provide additional tools to acquire the skills to perform this job. How can it help? Me, I would say it can help, and it was well illustrated by all four presentations. When the first thing is academic, especially the way we design it in with the LEAP. We are combining public health approach with a social historical approach with management approach. I mean, combining the best of the research and the training in this field of public health, the social history of humanitarian assistance, and what is on top of the research in terms of management. First of all, this academic knowledge can help us for a first thing, which is to take some distance with the head or the humanitarian subculture. I mean, we know that our world, our professional world, our professional culture is packed with cliché stereotypes, more than less actually influenced by post-colonial representation. And the first role of academic teaching for me is to get rid of this preconceived idea that there are universal needs, that principles are self-evident and can help us to secure our space, that there is such a thing as a community when we reach a village with an harmonious community, which has a clear view of what its needs are, and which we should just collect. That I'm taking many examples of cliché, like for instance, like here in Southern Africa, the idea that sexuality and traditional, sexual behavior are responsible for the spread of the HIV disease in Southern Africa, and is the main reason explaining the high prevalence of HIV in this part of the world. All these clichés, which are part of our culture, I would say, culture as a professional group. What academic training can help us to do is to get rid of them and to replace them with a broader view. I mean, and I think Abida, I was happy to have Abida make a point of how the course on the history of the humanitarian action has helped her to have a different view of our work and the way to relate with the so-called beneficiaries. So for me, yeah, social science especially, but not only, is really essential to deconstruct this cliché and to propose other frames. And this is where academic training is very useful. The second way it is useful, it was well explained as well, is to give a bit of readers in terms of methodology when it comes to analyze the situation, not drawing hasty conclusion from 2 interviews because you have 2 people who told you something, then you about the way, I don't know, the way people behave in a certain country, then it becomes a general rule. I mean, I'm talking about qualitative research at this point, but this training this introduction to the academic world, especially to the social science, give you a bit of reflex on how to build facts in a more rigorous way. And it's all the more true with quantitative research. And the course on how to read, critically speaking, evidence-based article on how to assess the strengths, the limitation of evidence. I mean, it's very key. So how the second take from academic teaching is this relationship to methodology to build strong evidence, knowing that our work is not evidence-based. I mean, for sure, we need some kind of readers the best readers we can have to analyze the situation, but we will never reach a point whereby our decision will just be purely evidence-based, because as I said before, there is always a high level of uncertainty with regards to the understanding of the context, with regards to the limitation of the scientific knowledge, especially in the medical field. So, but still, these readers in building facts. Voilà. Third thing I think is which academic training can help is to excite the appetite to go further, because of course through a LEAP you will not cover all the field which we touch upon when we are a humanitarian worker, as it was well illustrated by the first presentation, or the first scoping on humanitarian training. I mean, you cannot be an expert in conflict dynamics, on peace enforcement, on health system, on policy, on behavioral change, on epidemic control, on I don't know, water engineering, etc. You cannot be, but you cannot master all the academic knowledge related to all these fields which are related to our work. But still, with academic knowledge, you know that this knowledge exists somewhere. It can give you the will, the appetite to look for this information later on. Last point, I have to finish, huh, Imri? Yeah, 2 minutes. 2 last point. I think one key point as well, which was well illustrated by all the presentation on how academic work can help, is to develop a critical thinking. I mean, to be able to take some distance with what we do, to take a step aside, and to have a reflexive approach to what we do. And this go a lot through writing. I mean, the way the writing skill which are taught in academic circle, which are very different from the writing skill which are expected from a traditional head bureaucrat, you know, writing report in a very impersonal form. It's not something which helps you usually to understand what you do, what's going on, etc. You know, but to develop a reflexive approach through a practice of writing is for me, which is different from the one which we traditionally use to write reports. A practice of writing which is more precise, historical, analytical. Is key as well to improve our skill as humanitarian coordinator. And lastly, and I think the last point is, I think one of the best part of this LEAP experience is to create a community of practitioners. Because and to try to maybe go back to my first statements, according to which humanitarian coordination work is basically something you learn by doing. It's always something where you learn by sharing experience. And what will help you in a given situation is to compare this situation with a situation we have seen elsewhere, knowing that it's not exactly the same, but it's precisely because it has some commonality and some differences that it will help you to have ideas. And the more you enlarge the sphere of your experience, and the more you can share the experience of others when you are faced with a problem, ask the advice of someone who has been working in a very different situation, but maybe confronted to the same issue. I mean, to build a network of peers, to build a community of practitioners who can share experience. And I hope this community of LEAP students will last after LEAP. For me, it's one of the key achievements. So this is where I wanted to stop. I don't know, because I could not talk and read the question. I have a very interesting question on the side. I don't know if I should, it's for later, the question, huh? Okay.
Well, thank you very much, Fabrice. Sorry for the short time, but thank you very much for all that. That's really interesting reflection, and I think very relevant. What I suggest now, there's been some really interesting questions on the chat, and what I suggest is that for individual questions we maintain the chat, but I have some questions that I would like to share for everyone. But I would very much like to hear if people in the room in Sciences Po or those participating from or not panelists have any sort of follow-up questions that could be general for everyone before we go into any specific questions. You can raise your hands, or physically you can raise your hands if you have a question. Okay. So maybe I will start. We'll probably only have a couple time for 2 or 3 questions. This is a more of a general question because I've been trying to look at different themes, and one of the themes that I find is relevant to almost everyone is this balance between practice and academic skills or sort of teaching. And what, going back to Adriana and Nazanin presentation, it seems that the humanitarian masters, programs globally, from what the overview you see that was very useful, is sort of teaching practice to people who don't have practice, teaching practice to people who have, academic skill, instead of teaching, academic skill to people who have practice. We put a lot of effort, as you say in one of the slides. The practical component is mandatory in all these trainings because that's what students lack, basically. And once we sort of look at it, coming back to the vice to Fabrice's comment, is that what we need is practice. It's a practice that makes humanitarians function well. It's the comparative practice of different places, but some things you can't teach, or it's maybe more struggling to teach. Going back to sort of questions about programs like Bioforce or Red R that sort of try to teach you the practice of things that in a controlled environment, in a sense. And it made me not reflect, what would a humanitarian master's course designed by the South would look like? Some of the issues that we talked, the effort of participation, of qualitative care, of patient-focused care, seems to really emerge from Abel and Abida and Alia's presentation, which I thought was very interesting about sustainability. And maybe the general question is, this is a superficial, is the humanitarian education system reproducing a sort of a humanitarian practice that is unable to challenge itself? Is it legitimate to expect sort of massive challenges in the humanitarian world if we have a system that sort of says, oh, we need to give practice to the people who have knowledge or general knowledge, rather than sort of empower the people that have practice? So this is an open question. I mean, if anybody's interested, they can raise their hand.
I'm happy to jump in. I have so many thoughts on that. I think these are really great questions. I'll try to keep it brief though, so that others can jump in. I'll address this, I think, particularly from the perspective of the university, or sorry, the perspective of someone that is within a university system. That I think there's two systems here. You know, talk about is this part of the humanitarian system's inability to change itself? But then we're also within the university system. So I think it's a case where we have these two systems that have extreme downsides and extreme baggage, but also have a lot of good. And so to me, the thing that the university education system brings, and Fabrice, I loved it when you were talking about writing and what writing brings is that critical thinking and that expression. But I don't think we can kid ourselves and say, oh, you know, if someone learns how to write an essay, then that's going to solve everything. I think this is one component of transformative humanitarian practice. But I also think it's a bit reductive to assume that postgraduate education, really any training program in and of itself, can address really big systemic issues. But I'm very curious to hear the perspectives of others in this Zoom as well on that.
Comment line finally.
Thank you. Sorry, I just had to. Thank you very much, Nazanin. That's really interesting. I was wondering, from the people in the field, what is your reflections on that? You know, we see that. I was wondering, Abel, Alia, and Abida, what would be your position regarding to that?
Just I wanted to say something about this. It's just that it's not humanitarian aid is so different and so same at the same time that I don't think one system would completely change it, or write, like let's say talk about writing, would change it completely. It's very, very small things that mix together and make it better for the future. So what I would say is academic ideas about this will give us more broader perspective, but it does not replace the practice and the experience that you need on the field. But if you completely eliminate your education and just work on information, like how to be a coordinator. I learned it from, let's say, I didn't have any humanitarian education. I learned it from the person I saw it, and from experience that we can go through a tunnel vision. So I just learned from this XYZ person, and this is how I do things. That would miss a lot of perspective because it's so same and so different at the same time. So sitting in Maiduguri cannot be same in 2017 and 2021, but it has a lot of same components, same place. But there's a lot of similarities between Kenya and, let's say, Nigeria, but they're so different. So I think each component has its own role, and you cannot really eliminate one and it will be the same. But it has very, very small roles that makes it together to a very research-based, coherent practice. Does it make any sense?
Yeah, no, I think that makes total sense. And I think one of the things we want to be aware of, and I think that's true for education as it is true for humanitarians, we don't want to have a single type of humanitarianism, and we don't want to have a single type of humanitarian education in a sense. It's a diversity that makes the richness in a sense. I don't know, Fabrice, you see, I'm not sure if you agree. I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
I don't know. I may pass my turn on this one, but yeah, there is different. Yeah, of course, there is different expectation, definition of what we mean by humanitarianism. And I feel it should be part of, and it is part of the curriculum. I think Bertrand Tet's course is a good introduction to the diversity of conceptions of humanitarianism. I don't know if I can take this opportunity to answer some of the questions. There are some people rightly, I think it was Adriana and Mariana underlining the fact that there are some similarities between the constraint and the delay faced by the military and by humanitarianisms when it comes to training. And it's very true. It's very true that what characterizes both of our profession is to deal with radical uncertainty, especially because also we operate in the same kind of unstable environment when it comes to conflict situation. Not to say that this is the only type of environment we are dealing with, but still it's so. And how do military deals with this issue of training? First, they made a very active use of history. And militaries, they spend their life, their time studying former battles to see what has been done, what could have been done. So there is this reflexive approach, looking at the past. I mean, and it comes to the point of archive, because if you want to understand your past battle, you have to document your past battle. And I fully agree with the point made by our colleague from Bangladesh that our archive production and management is a disaster. And how can you learn if you're not keeping track of your action? I mean, so studying former battles and trying to maybe not to learn from the battle, because the next battle will not be like the previous one, but it will give you a point of comparison. It will give you more ideas to face a new situation. So one way they deal with this is through the study of history. Secondly, they have a human resource management, which unfortunately we cannot afford, but maybe we should stand to this. I mean, a French military is spent half of his, I mean, 1/3 of his time is in the field and in operation, 1/3 in school training, I mean, in school learning, and 1/3 maneuvering, training. So it's 1/3 of the time in operation and 2/3 of the time preparing for operation, divided into maneuvering and studying. Bon, maybe we are becoming, we have more resources. Maybe we should tend with this. One thing which struck me as well is that, and maybe this is something we have to think about when we think about training, maybe more about internal training, that the militaries are always amazed that we send in operation people who have never worked together. Militaries, they deploy a platoon, they deploy a company, they deploy people who know each other, who know what are the strengths and the weaknesses of each other and how they work together. This is not our case. So maybe we should also as well build training, bearing in mind that we don't only have to train people, we have to train teams. And well, that's what one point.
Thank you very much, Fabrice. I'm sorry, there's a lot of messages to that, but I just received a message from the organizing saying that we need to conclude, and what they suggested that we would move the discussion to the more general room. So we can continue the discussion there, but we need to be moved. So people in the general room, can you tell us people in the room, can you tell us how we move to the general room? Okay, so if you can see the link on the chat, that would take us to a more general discussion room, because they need the space.
Yeah, I post the link in the chat. So if you want to continue your discussions, you can go to the general discussion room for the topic.
Okay, so we will do that because we want to respect the housekeeping rule. I want to say big thank you for everyone. Big thank you for the team in Diakin, especially given the hour. Big thank to Alia, Abida, Abel, which are at their work location. So and thank you for Fabrice for bringing that together. Thank you for all the organizers and the attendants. I really look forward to continuing this discussion, and we're thinking of ways of sort of formalizing this into something else. So just the start of a discussion, but thank you very much for participating. I hope you will benefit from other presentations, and I look forward to seeing you on the other discussion. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.